The moment my feet touched American soil, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. 2 weeks of non-stop work in Tokyo had left me drained, both mentally and physically. As I navigated through Atlanta's bustling airport, my mind was already drifting towards the comfort of home, my cozy little house in the suburbs of Marietta, Georgia. I'm Claire Thompson, 32 years old, and a rising star in the world of international business consulting. This trip to Japan had been a make-or-break moment for my career, filled with back-to-back meetings, late-night conference calls, and endless presentations. I had barely slept, surviving on a diet of coffee and determination. But it had all paid off. The contracts were signed, the deals were sealed, and I was returning home victorious. As I waited for my luggage at the carousel, I couldn't help but smile. I imagined walking through my front door, dropping my bags, and falling into Richard's arms. My husband of 5 years, Richard was my rock, my constant support through the ups and downs of my demanding career. I pulled out my phone and sent him a quick text. Just landed. Can't wait to see you, babe. The cab ride from the airport to our house in East Cobb felt excruciatingly long. I watched the familiar landscape of Atlanta pass by, the towering skyscrapers giving way to leafy suburbs, the roads lined with magnolia trees in full bloom. It was early June, and the Georgia heat was already settling in, the air thick with humidity. Finally, we turned onto my street. My heart quickened as I spotted our little blue craftsman-style house, with its white trim and wraparound porch. But as we pulled up to the curb, something caught my eye that made me pause. Richard was standing on the porch, which wasn't unusual. He often waited for me there when I returned from trips. But there was something off about his posture. He was rigid, his smile seemed forced, and there was a tightness around his eyes that I'd never seen before. I brushed it off, chalking it up to my own exhaustion playing tricks on my mind. I paid the cab driver, grabbed my suitcase, and made my way up the front walk. The scent of gardenias from our flower beds filled the air, a smell I'd missed terribly while in Japan. "Welcome home, honey," Richard said, his voice a little too bright. He stepped forward and gave me a quick peck on the cheek, then immediately reached for my suitcase. "Let me get that for you. You must be exhausted." I followed him into the house, my eyes adjusting to the dim interior after the bright Georgia sunshine. Something felt off. I couldn't put my finger on it, but there was a strange emptiness to the air, a silence that seemed to echo through the rooms. Our house wasn't large, but I'd always prided myself on how well I kept it organized. Everything had its place, from the carefully arranged throw pillows on the couch to the precisely aligned picture frames on the mantel. But now, as I looked around, things seemed slightly askew. The pillows were rumpled, the pictures tilted ever so slightly. It was as if someone had picked everything up and put it back down, just a fraction of an inch off from where it should be. "Is everything okay?" I asked Richard, trying to keep my tone light. "The house feels different somehow." He laughed, but it sounded forced. "Different? No, everything's fine. You're probably just jet-lagged. Why don't you sit down and relax while I fix us some dinner?" I nodded, too tired to argue. I sank into our plush sofa, closing my eyes for a moment. When I opened them again, my gaze fell on our antique armoire in the corner of the living room. It had been a wedding gift from my grandmother, a beautiful cherrywood piece that had been in our family for generations. Inside, I kept my most prized possessions, my jewelry collection. Each piece in that collection told a story. There was the pearl necklace my mother had given me on my wedding day, the sapphire earrings I'd bought with my first big bonus, the vintage Cartier watch that had belonged to my great-aunt. But more than just expensive baubles, these pieces were a tangible connection to my family history, to the strong women who had come before me. I made a mental note to check on the jewelry later. For now, I needed a shower and a change of clothes. As I made my way upstairs, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. Our bedroom, usually a haven of calm and order, seemed subtly different. The bedspread was slightly crooked, the curtains not quite evenly drawn. I opened my closet and frowned. My clothes seemed rearranged. Not dramatically so, but enough that I noticed. I showered quickly, letting the hot water wash away the grime of travel. As I dried off and changed into fresh clothes, I tried to rationalize my unease. I was tired, I told myself. jet-lagged and overworked. Of course things would seem a little off after 2 weeks away. When I came back downstairs, Richard was in the kitchen, stirring something on the stove. The familiar smell of his famous chili filled the air, and I felt a pang of hunger. I hadn't realized how much I'd missed home-cooked meals. "Smells great," I said, walking up behind him and wrapping my arms around his waist. He stiffened slightly at my touch before relaxing. "Thanks," he said, turning to give me a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I thought you might want some comfort food after your trip." We sat down to eat, and I tried to engage Richard in conversation about my time in Japan. I told him about the beautiful gardens I'd visited in Kyoto during a rare free afternoon, about the incredible sushi I'd had in a tiny restaurant in Tokyo, about the challenging negotiations that had finally resulted in a major contract for our company. But Richard seemed distracted. He nodded at the right moments, made appropriate sounds of interest, but his eyes kept darting away from mine. When I asked him about his week, he gave vague answers about work and running errands for his mother. "Is everything okay with your mom?" I asked, concerned. Richard's mother, Susan, lived about an hour away in Macon. She was a sweet woman, if a bit overbearing at times, and I knew Richard worried about her living alone. "Oh, yeah, she's fine," Richard said quickly. "Just needed some help with, stuff around the house." I nodded, but something about his tone made me uneasy. Richard and I had always been open with each other, sharing the details of our days, our worries, our hopes. This evasiveness was new, and I didn't like it. After dinner, we settled on the couch to watch some TV. I tried to snuggle up to Richard like I usually did, but he seemed tense, holding himself slightly apart from me. As we watched a rerun of Friends, I found my mind wandering, unable to focus on the familiar jokes and storylines. My eyes kept drifting to the antique armoire in the corner. Something about it was nagging at me, but I couldn't put my finger on what. I made a mental note to check on my jewelry in the morning, when I was more alert. As we got ready for bed that night, the strangeness of the evening hung over us like a cloud. Richard was quieter than usual, his movements jerky and nervous as he changed into his pajamas. When we climbed into bed, he turned away from me, mumbling a quick goodnight before switching off his bedside lamp. I lay there in the darkness, listening to Richard's breathing, which never quite settled into the deep, even rhythm of sleep. My mind raced, trying to make sense of the odd atmosphere in the house, Richard's strange behavior, the subtle wrongness of everything around me. Part of me wanted to shake Richard awake, to demand answers, to clear the air between us. But another part, the part trained by years of corporate negotiations, held me back. Sometimes, the best strategy was to wait, to gather more information before making a move. So I lay there, wide awake despite my exhaustion, staring at the ceiling and trying to quiet the alarm bells ringing in my head. Tomorrow, I told myself. Tomorrow I would get to the bottom of this. Tomorrow, everything would make sense again. As I finally drifted off to sleep, I couldn't shake the feeling that my homecoming was just the beginning of something much bigger, much more complicated than I could have ever imagined. Little did I know how right I was, and how much my life was about to change. I woke up the next morning feeling groggy and disoriented. For a moment, I forgot where I was, the unfamiliar silence a stark contrast to the constant hum of Tokyo's streets. Then it all came flooding back. I was home, in my own bed, but something still felt off. Rolling over, I found Richard's side of the bed empty and cold. A glance at the clock told me it was just past 9 a.m. I'd slept for over 10 hours, my body finally succumbing to the exhaustion of the past 2 weeks. Still, I felt unsettled, the events of the previous evening nagging at the edges of my mind. I got up, threw on my robe, and made my way downstairs. The house was quiet. On the kitchen counter, I found a note from Richard, gone to run some errands. Back soon. His handwriting looked rushed, almost frantic. It was so unlike him to leave without saying goodbye, especially on my first morning back. I poured myself a cup of coffee and stood by the kitchen window, looking out at our backyard. The azaleas were in full bloom, their pink and white flowers a cheerful contrast to my somber mood. As I sipped my coffee, my eyes drifted to the antique armoire in the living room. Something about it had been bothering me since I got home, and I couldn't shake the feeling any longer. Setting down my mug, I walked over to the armoire. It had been in my family for generations, passed down from mother to daughter. I ran my hand over the smooth cherrywood surface, feeling the familiar curves and notches. Taking a deep breath, I opened the doors. The sight that greeted me made my heart stop. The drawers were empty. Completely, utterly empty. Not a single piece of jewelry remained. My hands shook as I pulled out drawer after drawer, desperately hoping I was mistaken. But there was no denying it. Every necklace, every ring, every pair of earrings was gone. I sank to my knees, my mind reeling. This wasn't just any jewelry collection. Each piece held a special memory, a connection to my family history. The pearl necklace my mother gave me on my wedding day, whispering how proud she was of the woman I'd become. The sapphire earrings I bought with my first big bonus, a symbol of my hard work and determination. The vintage Cartier watch that had belonged to my great-aunt, a reminder of the strong women in my family who had paved the way for my success. But it wasn't just the sentimental value that made my heart race. These pieces were worth a fortune, easily several $100,000. How could they just disappear? And why hadn't Richard noticed? As the initial shock wore off, anger began to set in. I stood up, my hands clenched into fists at my sides. Someone had been in our house, had violated our privacy, had taken something irreplaceable. And Richard? Where was Richard? I grabbed my phone and dialed his number, my fingers shaking. It went straight to voicemail. I tried again, and again, each time growing more frantic. On the fourth try, I left a message, my voice tight with barely controlled fury. Richard, where are you? The jewelry is gone. All of it. Call me back immediately. I paced the living room, my mind whirling with possibilities. Should I call the police? But what if it wasn't a burglary? What if? No, I couldn't let myself think like that. Richard would never, would he? The sound of a key in the lock made me freeze. The front door opened, and Richard walked in, carrying a bag of groceries. He stopped short when he saw me standing there, my face pale, my eyes wild. Claire, what's wrong? He asked, setting down the bag. The jewelry, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. It's all gone. I watched his face carefully, looking for any sign of surprise or concern. But what I saw instead made my blood run cold. There was no shock, no alarm. Instead, a look of resignation passed over his features, quickly replaced by a mask of calm. Oh, he said, his voice eerily steady. That. I repeated, incredulous. What do you mean, that? Richard, our house has been robbed. My family heirlooms are gone. He walked past me into the living room, sinking onto the couch. He looked tired, older somehow than he had just yesterday. We weren't robbed, Claire, he said quietly. I stared at him, uncomprehending. What are you talking about? Of course we were. The jewelry is gone. He looked up at me then, and the look in his eyes made my heart stop. It was a mixture of guilt, defiance, and something else I couldn't quite place. I sold it, he said. All of it. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. I gripped the back of a chair to steady myself, sure I had misheard him. You, what? I sold the jewelry, he repeated, his voice stronger now. Every last piece. I felt like I was in a dream, a horrible nightmare from which I couldn't wake up. Why? I managed to choke out. Why would you do that? Richard stood up then, pacing the room. My mother needed a new car. Her old one was falling apart, and she couldn't afford to replace it. I wanted to help her. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. So you sold my jewelry? Without asking me? Without even telling me? He had the grace to look ashamed for a moment, but then his expression hardened. You were gone for 2 weeks, Claire. You're always gone. Always working, always putting your job first. I made a decision. A decision? I repeated, my voice rising. It wasn't your decision to make. That jewelry didn't just belong to me, Richard. It was part of my family's history. And you just sold it off like it was nothing? He turned to face me, his eyes blazing. It's not nothing. It's a car for my mother. She needs it. She deserves it more than you deserve to have a fortune sitting in a box, unused. His words hit me like a physical blow. I staggered back, unable to process the venom in his voice. This wasn't the Richard the first knew, the man I had married. This was a stranger, someone capable of betraying me in the worst possible way. "How dare you?" I whispered, my voice shaking with rage. "How dare you make that judgment? You had no right, Richard. No right at all." He shrugged, a gesture so casual it made my blood boil. "What's done is done. The jewelry is gone, and Mom has her car. Maybe now you'll understand what really matters in life." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. The Richard the first knew would never have done something like this. He would never have betrayed my trust so completely, never have dismissed my feelings so callously. As I stood there, staring at this stranger wearing my husband's face, I felt something inside me break. "Get out," I said, my voice low and dangerous. He blinked, surprised. "What?" "Get out of this house," I repeated, louder this time. "Now. I can't even look at you right now." For a moment, he looked like he was going to argue. Then, without a word, he turned and walked out the front door. As it closed behind him, I sank to the floor, my body racked with sobs. I don't know how long I sat there, crying until I had no tears left. My mind kept replaying Richard's words, trying to make sense of what had happened. How could he have done this? How could he have betrayed me so completely? As the initial shock began to wear off, other thoughts started to creep in. The jewelry, it wasn't just sentimental. Some of those pieces were extremely valuable. And not all of them had belonged to me personally. With a jolt, I remembered the blue diamond necklace. It had been entrusted to me by my company, a piece we were using as collateral in a major business deal. My blood ran cold as I realized the full implications of what Richard had done. This wasn't just a personal betrayal. It was a professional catastrophe. If I couldn't recover that necklace, I could lose my job. Worse, I could face legal consequences. I scrambled to my feet, my mind racing. I needed to act fast. I needed to find out where Richard had sold the jewelry, to try and get it back before it was too late. But how? Where would I even start? As I reached for my phone to call my boss and explain the situation, I caught sight of myself in the mirror. My eyes were red and puffy, my hair a mess. I looked like a woman whose world had just fallen apart. And in many ways, it had. But I'm Claire Thompson. I've built my career on handling crises, on finding solutions where others see only problems. I took a deep breath, straightened my shoulders, and dialed the number. This was going to be the fight of my life, but I was ready for it. As I waited for my boss to pick up, I made a silent vow. I would get the jewelry back. I would save my career. And then, I would figure out what to do about the broken remains of my marriage. The phone clicked as my boss answered. "Hello, Claire? Is everything okay?" I took another deep breath. "No," I said, my voice steady despite the turmoil inside me. "Everything is not okay. But I'm going to fix it." And with those words, I stepped into the most challenging chapter of my life, not knowing where it would lead, but determined to come out stronger on the other side. I hung up the phone, my hand shaking. The conversation with my boss, Jack, had gone about as well as I could have expected, given the circumstances. Which is to say, not well at all. He was understandably furious, but at least he'd agreed to give me 48 hours to try and rectify the situation before involving the company's legal team. I sank onto the couch, my mind racing. How could I possibly fix this in just 2 days? And where was Richard? As if on cue, I heard the front door open. I steeled myself for another confrontation. Richard walked in, his face a mask of defiance. "I thought about what you said," he began, his voice tight. "But I stand by what I did. My mother needed that car, and your jewelry was just sitting there, unused." I stood up slowly, my anger from earlier replaced by a cold determination. "You still don't get it, do you, Richard?" I said, my voice unnervingly calm. "Those jewels weren't even mine to sell." His bravado faltered, confusion creeping into his expression. What do you mean they weren't yours?" I took a step closer, fixing him with a steady gaze. The jewelry belonged to my company, Richard. They weren't family heirlooms in the traditional sense. They were collateral, valuable assets the company entrusted to me for safekeeping. Do you even comprehend what you've done? The color drained from Richard's face as the implications of my words sank in. His earlier confidence crumbled, replaced by a look of dawning horror. But you never told me that, he stammered, his voice weak. How was I supposed to know? How were you supposed to know? I repeated, incredulous. You weren't supposed to know, Richard, because you weren't supposed to touch them at all. They weren't yours to sell, regardless of who they belonged to. What possessed you to think you had the right to make that decision? Richard sank into a chair, his head in his hands. I didn't think. No, you didn't think, I cut him off, my voice sharp. You didn't think about the consequences of your actions. You didn't think about how this would affect me, my career, our future. You just acted on impulse, and now we're both in serious trouble. He looked up at me, his eyes pleading. We can fix this, can't we? We can just buy the jewelry back, explain that it was a mistake. I laughed, but there was no humor in it. Buy it back? With what money, Richard? You sold it all, remember? And even if we could, it's not that simple. These weren't just random pieces of jewelry. They were specifically selected, appraised, and documented for a major business deal. A deal that's now in jeopardy because of your actions. The gravity of the situation seemed to finally hit Richard. He slumped in the chair, looking utterly defeated. What are we going to do? I shook my head. There is no we in this, Richard. You made this mess, but I'm the one who has to clean it up. My job, my reputation, potentially even my freedom is on the line here. Your freedom? Richard's voice was barely a whisper. What do you mean? I sighed, suddenly feeling exhausted. The blue diamond necklace, Richard. The centerpiece of the collection. It wasn't just valuable, it was part of a multi-million-dollar deal our company is negotiating. If I can't recover it, I could be accused of theft or fraud. Do you understand now? This isn't just about your mother's car or your misguided attempt at generosity. This is serious. Richard's face crumpled. I had no idea. Claire, I'm so sorry. I never meant to save it, I cut him off. Your apologies don't change anything. I need to focus on fixing this, and I don't have time to deal with your guilt right now. I turned away from him, my mind already racing through potential solutions. I needed to track down the jewelry, fast. But where to start? I didn't even know where Richard had sold the pieces. Richard, I said, not turning to look at him. I need you to write down every detail you can remember about where you sold the jewelry. Every shop, every pawnbroker, every online site. Everything. Can you do that? I heard him move, presumably nodding. Yes, of course. I'll get started right away. As he hurried off to compile the list, I pulled out my phone and started making calls. First to my assistant, asking her to clear my schedule for the next 2 days. Then to a few trusted colleagues who might have connections in the jewelry world. I was calling in every favor I had, pulling every string I could think of. Hours passed in a blur of phone calls, emails, and frantic online searches. Richard brought me his list, and I added the information to my growing web of potential leads. He hovered nearby, clearly wanting to help but not knowing how. I ignored him, too focused on my task to deal with his presence. As night fell, I found myself staring at a map of Atlanta, dotted with pins representing every jewelry store, pawnshop, and auction house in the city. It was overwhelming, but I couldn't afford to feel discouraged. Somewhere out there was my company's property, and I was going to find it. I was so engrossed in my work that I barely noticed when Richard placed a sandwich and a cup of coffee next to me. You should eat something, he said quietly. I glanced at the food, then at Richard. For a moment, I saw a glimmer of the man I'd married, caring, thoughtful. But then I remembered what he'd done, and the warmth I felt turned to ice. Thank you, I said stiffly, turning back to my work. Richard lingered for a moment. Claire, I know I've messed up terribly, but I want to help. Please, let me do something. I looked up at him, really looked at him for the first time since this nightmare began. He looked haggard, his eyes red-rimmed, his shoulders slumped with the weight of his actions. Part of me wanted to comfort him, to tell him we'd get through this together. But a larger part, the part focused on survival, knew I couldn't afford that luxury. "You want to help?" I said, my voice level. "Then give me space to work. I need to focus, and I can't do that with you hovering around, reminding me of how we got into this mess in the first place." He flinched at my words but nodded. "I understand. I'll be upstairs if you need anything." As he trudged up the stairs, I turned back to my task. I couldn't afford to dwell on the state of our relationship right now. I had a job to do, and failure wasn't an option. The next morning dawned bright and clear, a beautiful Georgia spring day that seemed to mock the turmoil of my life. I'd barely slept, spending most of the night making calls to contacts in different time zones, trying to track down any lead on the jewelry. I was on my third cup of coffee when my phone rang. It was an unknown number, but I answered immediately, hope surging through me. "Hello, is this Claire Thompson?" a male voice asked. "Yes, this is she," I replied, trying to keep the desperation out of my voice. "Mrs. Thompson, this is David Klein from Klein's Jewelry on Peachtree Street. I believe I may have some information about the items you're looking for." My heart leapt. "Yes, Mr. Klein. What can you tell me?" "A man came in about a week ago with a rather unique collection of jewelry. Some of the pieces match the descriptions you've been circulating. I didn't purchase them, something felt off about the situation, but I remember the man clearly." I gripped the phone tighter. "Can you describe him?" As Mr. Klein described the seller, my suspicions were confirmed. It was Richard, without a doubt. But more importantly, this was the first solid lead I'd had. "Mr. Klein, did the man mention where he was going next? Or any other shops he'd visited?" There was a pause on the other end of the line. "He did mention something about heading to the Diamond District in New York. Said he had a friend there who might be interested in some of the more valuable pieces." My blood ran cold. If Richard had taken some of the jewelry to New York, my task had just become infinitely more complicated. But at least now I had a direction. "Thank you, Mr. Klein," I said, my mind already racing with this new information. "You've been incredibly helpful." As I hung up, I knew what I had to do next. I needed to go to New York. It was a long shot, but it was the best lead I had. I quickly booked a flight for that afternoon, then headed upstairs to pack a bag. Richard was in our bedroom, sitting on the edge of the bed. He looked up as I entered, his eyes widening at the sight of my determined expression. "What's happening?" he asked, his voice tentative. "I have a lead," I said, pulling out a suitcase. "I'm going to New York." "New York?" he repeated, standing up. "Why? What did you find out?" I paused in my packing, fixing him with a steady gaze. "You took some of the jewelry to the Diamond District in New York, didn't you?" He paled, then nodded slowly. "Yes, I had a friend there who said he might be interested in some of the more valuable pieces." "How did you know?" "It doesn't matter how I know," I said, resuming my packing. "What matters is that I'm going there to try and track them down." Richard stepped closer. "Let me come with you. I can help. I know the guy I spoke to. No," I cut him off firmly. "You've done enough. I need to handle this on my own." He opened his mouth as if to argue, then closed it again, nodding in resignation. "I understand. Just be careful, okay?" I zipped up my suitcase, then turned to face him. "Richard, when I get back, we need to have a serious conversation about our future. But right now, I need to focus on fixing this mess. I hope you understand." He nodded again, his eyes filled with a mixture of guilt and fear. "I do. And Claire, I'm sorry. I know it doesn't change anything, but I am truly, deeply sorry." I looked at him for a long moment, seeing the man I'd fallen in love with, the man who'd betrayed me so completely, and the broken shell he'd become in the aftermath. It was all too much to process right now. "I know," I said simply, then picked up my suitcase and headed for the door. As I reached the threshold, I paused and looked back at him. "Goodbye, Richard." And with that, I walked out, ready to face whatever challenges awaited me in New York, determined to set things right no matter the cost. The moment I stepped off the plane at JFK, I felt the weight of my mission settle heavily on my shoulders. New York's bustling energy, usually invigorating, now felt overwhelming. I had 36 hours left to find the jewelry before my boss involved the company's legal team, potentially ending my career and worse. I hailed a taxi, giving the address of a small hotel in Midtown I'd booked last minute. As we wove through the city's crowded streets, I pulled out my phone and started making calls. My first stop would be the Diamond District, but I needed more information before I dove in blindly. At the hotel, I barely noticed the cramped room or the view of a brick wall outside my window. I spread out my notes on the small desk, creating a makeshift command center. A map of the Diamond District covered in red circles marked potential shops Richard might have visited. Lists of names and phone numbers of contacts I'd made over the years in the jewelry business. And at the center of it all, a photo of the blue diamond necklace, the most valuable and crucial piece I needed to recover. I allowed myself a moment to close my eyes and take a deep breath. The enormity of what I was attempting hit me all at once. I was trying to find a handful of jewelry pieces in one of the busiest, most jewel-dense areas in the world, with nothing but a vague description and a hope that Richard's friend hadn't already sold them off. But I couldn't afford to wallow in despair. I checked my watch, 9:30 a.m. The shops would be opening soon. It was time to hit the streets. The Diamond District was already buzzing with activity when I arrived. Jewelry store owners were setting up their displays, early bird customers were peering into windows, and the air was filled with a palpable sense of commerce and possibility. On any other day, I might have enjoyed the atmosphere. Today, it just added to my anxiety. I started with the larger, more reputable stores first. I figured they were more likely to remember a sale as significant as the pieces Richard had to offer. But store after store, my inquiries were met with shaking heads and apologetic smiles. Some recognized the descriptions of the pieces, especially the blue diamond necklace, but none had seen them in person. By lunchtime, I was exhausted and disheartened. I ducked into a small deli, more to escape the constant rejection than out of hunger. As I picked at a sandwich, I scrolled through my phone, looking for any contacts I might have missed. That's when I saw it. A message from Richard. My thumb hovered over the delete button, but curiosity won out. I opened it. Claire, I know you're angry, and you have every right to be. But I remembered something that might help. The friend I spoke to in New York, his name is Mike Goldstein. He owns a small shop called Golden Opportunities. I'm so sorry for everything. Please let me know if there's anything else I can do to help. I stared at the message, a mix of emotions swirling inside me. Anger at Richard for getting me into this mess. Frustration that he hadn't remembered this crucial information earlier. But also, a tiny flicker of hope. This was the lead I'd been looking for. I quickly looked up Golden Opportunities. It was a small shop, easily overlooked among the glitzier stores in the district. But it was open, and it was close. I left my half-eaten sandwich and all but ran out of the deli. The shop was tucked away on a side street, its window display modest compared to its neighbors. A bell tinkled as I pushed open the door, and I found myself in a cozy, cluttered space filled with display cases and the quiet hum of fluorescent lights. An older man looked up from behind the counter, his glasses perched on the end of his nose. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice gruff but not unkind. I took a deep breath. "Are you Mike Goldstein?" He nodded slowly, his eyes narrowing slightly. "I am. And you are?" "My name is Claire Thompson," I said, stepping closer to the counter. "I believe you may have spoken to my husband, Richard, about a week ago. About some jewelry he was looking to sell." Mike's expression changed instantly, a mix of recognition and wariness crossing his face. "Ah, yes. Richard. Nice fellow. Had some very interesting pieces." My heart raced. This was it, the closest I'd come to finding the jewelry. "Mr. Goldstein, those pieces weren't Richard's to sell. They belong to the company I work for, and I need to get them back. Please, can you tell me what happened to them?" Mike studied me for a long moment, then sighed. I had a feeling something wasn't quite right about that sale. Your husband seemed nervous. But the pieces were so beautiful, and the price was too good to pass up. My stomach dropped. You bought them? He nodded. Most of them, yes. But not all. I leaned forward, hope surging through me. The blue diamond necklace. Did you buy that one? Mike shook his head. No, that one was too rich for my blood. Beautiful piece, though. I suggested Richard take it to Levinson's down the street. They handle higher-end pieces like that. I felt a mix of relief and renewed anxiety. The most important piece was still out there, possibly still unsold. Mr. Goldstein, I need to get those pieces back. All of them. I know you paid for them, and I promise my company will reimburse you. But please, I need them back. Mike looked at me for a long moment, then nodded slowly. I can see this means a lot to you. And truth be told, I've been feeling uneasy about that sale ever since. Wait here. He disappeared into a back room, leaving me to wait in agonizing suspense. When he returned, he was carrying a familiar velvet box. My breath caught in my throat as he opened it, revealing the familiar glint of my company's jewelry. It's all here, Mike said, except for that blue diamond necklace, of course. I felt tears spring to my eyes as I looked at the recovered pieces. Mr. Goldstein, thank you. You have no idea what this means to me. He waved off my thanks. Just doing what's right. Now, about that necklace, Levinson's closes in an hour. If you hurry, you might catch them before they shut up shop. I nodded, carefully taking the velvet box and securing it in my bag. Thank you again. I'll have my company contact you about reimbursement. As I turned to leave, Mike called out, "Good luck, Mrs. Thompson. I hope you find what you're looking for." I all but ran down the street to Levinson's, my heart pounding with a mixture of hope and fear. The shop was larger and more upscale than Golden Opportunities, with armed security at the door and dazzling displays in the windows. Inside, I approached the counter, trying to keep my voice steady as I inquired about the blue diamond necklace. The salesperson's eyes widened at my description, and she hurried to fetch the manager. The manager, a sleek woman in her 50s, listened to my story with a neutral expression. When I finished, she nodded once and disappeared into the back. The minutes she was gone felt like hours. When she returned, she was carrying a familiar case. My breath caught as she opened it, revealing the stunning blue diamond necklace nestled inside. "We haven't put it up for sale yet," she explained. Something about it didn't feel quite right. I'm glad we trusted our instincts. As I looked at the necklace, the full weight of the past few days hit me. I'd done it. Against all odds, I'd recovered all the jewelry. The relief was so overwhelming I felt lightheaded. The manager must have noticed my reaction. "Are you all right, Mrs. Thompson?" she asked, concern in her voice. I nodded, blinking back tears. "Yes, I'm fine. Just relieved. You have no idea how important this is." She smiled kindly. "I think I have some idea. Now, let's talk about getting this back to its rightful owners, shall we?" The next few hours passed in a blur of paperwork, phone calls, and arrangements for secure transport of the jewelry back to Atlanta. By the time I finally made it back to my hotel room, it was well past midnight. I sank onto the bed, utterly exhausted but filled with an overwhelming sense of accomplishment. I'd done it. I'd saved my career, my reputation, and quite possibly avoided legal trouble. As the adrenaline of the day wore off, other thoughts began to creep in. Thoughts of Richard, of our marriage, of the trust that had been shattered. We still had so much to deal with, so many conversations to have. But for now, I allowed myself to relax. I'd faced an impossible situation and come out on top. Whatever challenges lay ahead, I knew I had the strength to face them. As I drifted off to sleep, I made a promise to myself. No matter what happened with Richard, no matter where my career took me next, I would never again let anyone else have so much power over my life and my future. From now on, I was in control. Tomorrow, I would fly back to Atlanta and face whatever awaited me there. But tonight, I would rest, secure in the knowledge that I had overcome the greatest challenge of my professional life. And whatever came next, I would be ready for it. The flight back to Atlanta felt both impossibly long and far too short. As the plane touched down, I felt a mix of relief and dread settle in my stomach. I had succeeded in my mission, the jewelry was safe, my career intact. But now, I had to face Richard and the wreckage of our marriage. I took a deep breath as I exited the airport, the warm Georgia air enveloping me like a familiar blanket. Part of me wanted to go straight to the office, to bask in the glow of my success and delay the inevitable confrontation. But I knew I couldn't put it off any longer. It was time to face the music. The taxi ride home was a blur of familiar sights that now felt strangely alien. As we pulled up to my house, our house, I saw Richard's car in the driveway. My heart rate picked up. He was home, waiting for me. I paid the driver and stood on the sidewalk for a moment, staring at the front door. This house that had once been my sanctuary now felt like a battleground. With a deep breath, I squared my shoulders and walked up the path. I had barely closed the door behind me when Richard appeared from the living room. He looked terrible, unshaven, dark circles under his eyes, his clothes rumpled as if he'd slept in them. For a moment, I felt a pang of sympathy. Then I remembered why we were in this situation, and my resolve hardened. "Claire," he said, his voice hoarse. "You're back." Did you find the jewelry?" I nodded, setting my bag down. "Yes, I did. No thanks to you." He flinched at my tone but pressed on. That's great news. I'm so relieved." "Claire," I held up a hand, cutting him off. "Not now, Richard. I'm exhausted, I'm jet-lagged, and I'm in no state to have this conversation right now. I'm going to take a shower and get some rest. We'll talk later." Without waiting for his response, I headed upstairs. I could feel his eyes on me as I went, but I didn't look back. I needed time to gather my thoughts, to process everything that had happened. The hot water of the shower helped to clear my head somewhat, but it also brought all my emotions bubbling to the surface. Anger, hurt, betrayal, they all swirled together, threatening to overwhelm me. By the time I stepped out, wrapped in my favorite fluffy robe, I felt raw and exposed. I half expected Richard to be waiting outside the bathroom, but the upstairs hallway was empty. As I dressed in comfortable clothes, I could hear him moving around downstairs. The familiar sounds of home, the creak of that one floorboard near the kitchen, the hum of the refrigerator, felt surreal after the chaos of the past few days. Finally, knowing I couldn't put it off any longer, I made my way downstairs. Richard was in the living room, pacing back and forth like a caged animal. He stopped when he saw me, his face a mask of anxiety and remorse. "Claire," he began, "I know I've made a terrible mistake. I'm so sorry. If there's anything I can do to make this right, make this right." I interrupted, my voice sharp. "Richard, do you have any idea what you've put me through? What you've risked?" He nodded, looking miserable. I know. I never meant for any of this to happen. I just wanted to help my mom, and I don't know what I thought. It was stupid and selfish, and I'm sorry." I sank into an armchair, suddenly feeling very tired. "Sorry doesn't cut it, Richard. You betrayed my trust in the worst possible way. You put my career at risk. Do you understand that I could have faced legal consequences because of your actions?" Richard's face paled. I didn't realize. "Claire, I swear, I never meant to cause you any harm. I love you. I would never intentionally do anything to hurt you." I laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Love me? Is this how you show love, Richard? By going behind my back, selling something that wasn't yours to sell, and then having the audacity to act like I was in the wrong for being upset about it?" He sat down heavily on the couch, his head in his hands. "I know. I messed up. I messed up so badly. I don't know what came over me. I saw my mom struggling, and I wanted to be her hero. I wanted to solve her problems. I didn't think about the consequences." I shook my head, frustration building. "That's the problem, Richard. You didn't think. You didn't think about me, about us, about our future. You just acted on impulse, and now we're both paying the price." We sat in silence for a moment, the weight of everything that had happened hanging heavy between us. Finally, Richard spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. Can you ever forgive me, Claire? I looked at him, really looked at him. The man I had fallen in love with, the man I had built a life with, the man who had betrayed me so completely. I searched his face for any sign of the person I thought I knew, but all I saw was a stranger. I don't know, Richard, I said honestly. I really don't know. You've broken something between us, something fundamental. Trust, respect, partnership, all the things that make a marriage work. I'm not sure those things can be repaired. He nodded, tears welling in his eyes. I understand. But please, Claire, give me a chance to try. Tell me what I can do to make this right. I'll do anything. I stood up, needing to put some physical distance between us. It's not that simple. This isn't something you can fix with a grand gesture or a heartfelt apology. You've shown me a side of yourself that I never knew existed, and I'm not sure I can ever look at you the same way again. Richard stood too, reaching out as if to touch me, then thinking better of it. What are you saying, Claire? Are you leaving me? The question hung in the air, heavy with implication. I took a deep breath, trying to sort through the tumult of emotions inside me. I don't know, I said finally. I honestly don't know what I want right now. I need time, Richard. Time to think, to process everything that's happened. I can't make any decisions right now. He nodded, looking lost. I understand. Take all the time you need. I'll be here, ready to do whatever it takes to make this right between us. I looked around the room, at all the familiar objects that suddenly felt alien. The photos of us on the mantel, smiling and happy. The throw pillows we had picked out together. The little knickknacks we had collected on our travels. All of it felt like it belonged to a different life, a different Claire and Richard. I began, then paused, gathering my courage. I think I need to stay somewhere else for a while. I can't be in this house right now. There are too many memories, too much, everything. Richard's face fell, but he nodded. Of course. Whatever you need. You can stay at my sister's place if you want. She's out of town for a few weeks. Or I could go, if you'd rather stay here. I shook my head. No, I'll go. I need a complete change of scenery. I'll book a hotel for now, figure out something more permanent later. As I moved to go upstairs and pack a bag, Richard called out, Claire? I really am sorry. For everything. I know it doesn't change anything, but I need you to know that. I paused on the stairs, not turning to look at him. I know you are, Richard. But sometimes, sorry isn't enough. As I packed my bag, my mind was a whirlwind of thoughts and emotions. Part of me wanted to forgive Richard, to try and salvage our marriage. But a larger part, the part that had fought so hard to fix his mistake, knew that things could never go back to the way they were. When I came back downstairs, suitcase in hand, Richard was still in the living room. He looked up as I entered, his eyes red-rimmed and pleading. Will you keep in touch? He asked, his voice small. I nodded. I'll let you know where I end up staying. And we'll need to talk about practicalities. Bills, the house, that sort of thing. But not now. I need some space, Richard. I hope you can understand that. He nodded, looking defeated. I understand. And Claire, thank you, for not involving the police. For fixing my mistake. I know I don't deserve your protection. I paused at the door, my hand on the knob. I didn't do it for you, Richard. I did it to save my career, and to protect the company. Don't mistake my actions for forgiveness. With that, I walked out the door, letting it close behind me with a soft click. As I put my suitcase in the trunk of my car, I felt a strange mix of sadness and liberation. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in days, I felt like I could breathe again. As I drove away from the house, from Richard, from the life we had built together, I didn't know what the future held. But I knew one thing for certain: whatever happened next, it would be on my terms. I had saved my career by my own efforts, and now it was time to save myself. The road ahead was long and uncertain, but as I merged onto the highway, heading towards an unknown destination, I felt a glimmer of hope. This wasn't the end of my story. It was just the beginning of a new chapter. 6 months have passed since that fateful day I walked out of my home, leaving Richard and our shattered marriage behind. As I stand at the window of my new apartment in Midtown Atlanta, watching the city buzz with life below, I can hardly believe how much has changed. The first few weeks after leaving were a blur of hotel rooms and sleepless nights. I threw myself into work, using it as a shield against the pain and confusion that threatened to overwhelm me. My colleagues were supportive, impressed by how I had handled the jewelry crisis. If they noticed the dark circles under my eyes or the way my smile never quite reached my eyes, they didn't mention it. It was during this time that I realized something important. I needed a change. Not just in my personal life, but in my career as well. The jewelry incident had shown me just how precarious my position was, how easily everything I had worked for could be taken away. I knew I couldn't continue on the same path. So, I made a decision that surprised everyone, including myself. I left my job. I can still remember the look of shock on my boss's face when I handed in my resignation. "But Claire," he had sputtered, "after everything you did to save the deal, to protect the company, why leave now?" I had smiled, feeling more certain of my decision with every passing moment. Because I realized that I'm capable of more than I ever thought possible. I want to build something of my own, something that can't be taken away by someone else's actions. And that's exactly what I did. Using the connections I'd built over the years and the reputation I'd earned from handling the jewelry crisis, I started my own consulting firm. It was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. There were nights when I lay awake, doubting my decision, wondering if I had made a terrible mistake. But with each new client, each successful project, those doubts began to fade. Now, 6 months in, my firm is thriving. We specialize in crisis management and strategic planning for businesses in transition. The irony isn't lost on me. I'm using the skills I honed during the darkest period of my life to help others navigate their own storms. As I turn away from the window and survey my new home, I feel a sense of pride. It's smaller than the house I shared with Richard, but it's mine. Every piece of furniture, every decoration, was chosen by me, for me. It's a physical representation of my newfound independence. My phone buzzes with a text message. It's from my sister, Kate. "Dinner tonight? That new Thai place on Peachtree?" I smile as I type back a quick yes. Kate has been my rock through all of this. She was the one who helped me find this apartment, who sat with me through long nights of tears and anger, who celebrated with me when I landed my first big client. As I get ready for dinner, I catch sight of myself in the mirror. The woman looking back at me is different from the one who boarded a plane to New York 6 months ago, desperate to save her career and her marriage. This woman stands taller, her eyes clearer, her smile more genuine. She's been through fire and come out stronger on the other side. At the restaurant, Kate greets me with a warm hug. "You look great, sis," she says as we sit down. "That new project must be going well." I nod, feeling a surge of excitement. It is. We're helping a tech startup navigate a major expansion. It's challenging, but in all the right ways. As we chat over steaming plates of pad thai and green curry, I find myself marveling at how normal this feels. There was a time, not so long ago, when I couldn't imagine ever feeling this content. "So," Kate says, setting down her fork, "have you heard from Richard lately?" The question doesn't sting the way it used to. I shake my head. Not since the divorce was finalized last month. "I think it's better this way." Kate nods, her expression a mix of sympathy and pride. "You've come so far, Claire. I hope you know how amazing you are." I feel a lump form in my throat, touched by her words. "I couldn't have done it without you, Kate. You've been my lifeline through all of this." She reaches across the table and squeezes my hand. "That's what sisters are for. But give yourself some credit. You're the one who picked yourself up and built this new life." As we leave the restaurant, full of good food and even better conversation, I find myself reflecting on the journey of the past 6 months. The pain of Richard's betrayal hasn't disappeared entirely. I doubt it ever will. But it no longer defines me. It's become a part of my story, a chapter that led me to where I am now. The next morning, I'm up early, preparing for an important client meeting. As I review my notes, my phone rings. It's an unknown number, but something compels me to answer. Hello, is this Claire Thompson? A woman's voice asks. Yes, this is she, I reply, curiosity piqued. Ms. Thompson, this is Sandra Patel from Woodruff Arts Center. We're putting together a panel on women in business for our upcoming leadership symposium, and your name came highly recommended. We were wondering if you'd be interested in participating. I find myself grinning, excitement bubbling up inside me. I'd be honored, Ms. Patel. Can you tell me more about the symposium? As she outlines the details, I feel a sense of validation wash over me. 6 months ago, I was fighting to save my career. Now, I'm being invited to speak as an expert, to share my experiences with others. After ending the call, I allow myself a moment of celebration. This feels like a milestone, a tangible sign of how far I've come. I make a mental note to call Kate later and share the news. As I head out for my client meeting, I pass by a small jewelry store. I pause for a moment, looking at the glittering displays in the window. For a split second, I'm transported back to that desperate search through New York's Diamond District. But this time, the memory doesn't bring pain or anxiety. Instead, I feel a sense of pride in how I handled that crisis, in the strength I found within myself. On an impulse, I step into the store. A friendly saleswoman approaches, asking if I need any help. Actually, I say, surprising myself, I'm looking for a necklace. Something simple, but elegant. A gift to myself. She smiles and leads me to a display case. Celebrating something special, she asks. I consider her question for a moment. Am I celebrating? In a way, I suppose I am. I'm celebrating my resilience, my independence, my new beginning. Yes, I reply, smiling. I'm celebrating a new chapter in my life. As I leave the store, a small box tucked into my purse, I feel a sense of closure. The necklace isn't a replacement for what was lost, it's a symbol of what I've gained. Strength, independence, a newfound sense of self. The rest of the day flies by in a whirlwind of meetings and phone calls. By the time I return to my apartment in the evening, I'm exhausted but exhilarated. It's been a good day, the kind that reminds me why I took this leap in the first place. I pour myself a glass of wine and step out onto my small balcony. The Atlanta skyline glitters before me, a tapestry of lights and possibilities. As I sip my wine, I reflect on the journey that brought me here. 6 months ago, I thought my world was ending. The betrayal by Richard, the near loss of my career, it all seemed insurmountable. But standing here now, I realize that what I thought was an ending was actually a beginning. It was the push I needed to rediscover myself, to build a life that truly reflects who I am and what I want. I think about the woman I was before all this happened, confident in her career, but complacent in her personal life. I think about the woman I became in the aftermath, broken, but determined to put herself back together. And I think about the woman I am now, stronger, wiser, more authentically myself than I've ever been. As I head back inside, I catch sight of my reflection in the window. I see a woman who has weathered a storm and come out stronger for it. A woman who took control of her own story and wrote herself a new ending, or rather, a new beginning. I don't know what the future holds. There will undoubtedly be more challenges, more obstacles to overcome. But for the first time in a long time, I'm excited to face them. Because now I know, I'm capable of so much more than I ever imagined. As I get ready for bed, I think about all the women out there facing their own struggles, their own betrayals and setbacks. I hope that by sharing my story at the upcoming symposium, I can offer them some hope, some encouragement. If I can rebuild my life, so can they. Tomorrow is a new day, full of possibilities. And I, Claire Thompson, am ready for whatever it brings. This new chapter of my life is just beginning, and I can't wait to see where it leads.